He didn't even look up from the papers on his desk when he said it. Harlan Bates leaned back in his chair, his boots propped on the edge of the table like he owned the whole territory. And in his mind, he already did. He just told the young woman standing at the door of the Broken Spur Ranch that the job she'd ridden 3 days to find was gone. Filled. Done. Then he smiled, slow, satisfied, and said, "A woman alone out here don't last long, sweetheart. You'd do better moving along before the sun goes down." He wasn't warning her. He was enjoying it. And in that moment, Magnolia Winters, 26 years old, 43 cents to her name, and standing in the dust of a place she'd never been, made a decision that would change the rest of her life. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you desperately needed to be, stay with me, because this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next inside that ranch house? Nobody saw it coming. The morning Magnolia Winters rode into Cutter's Creek, Arizona, she had exactly 3 things left in the world. The worn leather satchel her mother had carried across Tennessee before the fever took her. A folded advertisement torn from a St. Louis newspaper, creased so many times the ink had begun to fade. And a stubbornness that people had been trying to beat out of her since she was 12 years old, and had never quite managed to. She'd been on the road for 11 days. Not 11 comfortable days on a proper rail line with a sleeper car and a dining compartment. 11 days of hitching rides on freight wagons, walking when there were no wagons, eating whatever was offered and pretending she wasn't hungry when nothing was. The soles of her boots had worn thin enough that she could feel every pebble through the leather. Her dress, her only dress now, since she'd sold the other 2 for stage fare in New Mexico, had a tear along the right hem she'd sewn up 3 times and given up on the 4th. She did not look like a woman who was going to be fine, but she'd learned a long time ago that how you looked and what you were made of were 2 entirely separate things. The advertisement had promised ranch work in the Arizona territory. Capable hands sought, room and board provided. Inquire at Broken Spur Ranch, 12 miles south of Cutter's Creek. That was all it said. No mention of whether they'd take a woman, no mention of what kind of work. But Magnolia had spent the last 4 years keeping her father's accounting books, managing 3 hired men, negotiating with suppliers who tried to cheat them because they were a small operation and her father's hands had started shaking from the drink. She knew how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. She knew how to work. What she didn't know was how to grieve and keep moving at the same time. Her father, Gerald Winters, had died 6 weeks earlier. Not dramatically, not heroically. He'd simply sat down in the chair by the window one evening after supper, said he was tired, and never woke up. The doctor said it was his heart. Magnolia knew it was something more complicated than that. A combination of failed harvests, borrowed money, and a pride that had slowly eaten him from the inside. The creditors had come within 2 weeks. Polite at first, then not polite at all. The farm in Ohio was gone before she'd finished making sense of what had happened. She'd packed the satchel, kept the ledger books out of habit, and started moving west because standing still felt like drowning. Cutter's Creek was not what she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined much. She was too tired for imagination. But the town was smaller and harder looking than even her reduced expectations. A main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon that sounded occupied even at 10 in the morning, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph station. Women moved along the boardwalk in pairs, never alone. Men on horseback barely glanced at her. She asked a woman sweeping her front step for directions to Broken Spur Ranch. The woman looked at her, really looked, the way people do when they're calculating something, and said, "You looking for work out there?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman's expression shifted into something Magnolia couldn't quite name. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to resignation. 12 miles south, turn at the dead cottonwood. Can't miss the gate. Then she went back to sweeping. "Watch yourself," she added, without turning around. Magnolia almost asked what that meant. She kept walking instead. Lam. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Horses, hay, wood smoke, and something else. Cattle, she realized. A whole lot of them, somewhere beyond the rise. The gate was iron, solid work, with the letters BSR across the top. The kind of gate that said someone had built this place with intention. The kind of gate that said, "This is mine," in a language older than words. The house itself was not grand. 2 stories, wood frame, a porch that ran the length of the front. Functional. The barn was larger than the house, which told her something about the priorities of whoever ran this place. There were hands working in the yard. She counted 4 before she reached the gate, and every one of them stopped what they were doing to watch her walk up the path. She ignored that. She'd been ignored in worse ways. Being watched was easy. The front door was open. She knocked on the frame. "Whatever you're selling, we don't need it." The voice came from inside, deeper than she expected. Not unfriendly exactly, but not welcoming either. Flat. The voice of someone who said what they meant and didn't waste breath on cushioning it. "I'm not selling anything," Magnolia said. "I'm here about the advertisement, the one in the St. Louis paper." A pause. "That advertisement ran 8 months ago." She felt something drop in her chest, fast and hard, like a stone through water. 8 months. She'd been chasing an 8-month-old notice. "I didn't know that," she said. She worked to keep her voice level. "I apologize for taking up your time." She turned to go. Her hand was already reaching back toward the gate. "How far'd you come?" She stopped, turned back. "Ohio originally, most recently from Albuquerque." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Come in." It wasn't an invitation so much as a command, but she'd learned not to be precious about the difference. Preston Blackwood was 29 years old, and he looked like the last 3 years had put 10 more on him. He was sitting behind a desk that had seen better decades, covered in papers, and what appeared to be a surveyor's map with portions circled in red ink. He was tall, she could tell even seated, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than any vanity about it. Dark hair, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days, hands that were calloused enough to catch the light differently than ordinary skin. He did not stand when she entered. She noted that, and filed it away in the part of her mind that kept track of such things. He looked at her the way she'd been looked at since the moment she crossed into Arizona, assessing, a little guarded, like she might be the advanced scout for some complication he didn't have time for. "You said you're here about the work," he said. "I did." "What kind of work were you expecting?" "Whatever you need done," she said. "I've managed livestock accounting, supplier negotiations, payroll for hired hands. I can ride. Not fancy, but reliable. I can cook adequately. I learn fast." Preston Blackwood said nothing for a moment. He picked up a pen, turned it in his fingers, set it back down. "The position was filled months ago," he said. "I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing." "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Any other work?" "Not for a woman alone." The way he said it wasn't cruel. It wasn't Harlan Bates's oily satisfaction. It was simply the way he'd arrived at a fact and stated it, the way you'd say the fence needs mending or rain's coming, just the shape of the world as he saw it. That was almost worse. "I'm not particular about the type of work," she said carefully. "I'm particular about eating, and I haven't done that properly in a while." Something moved across his face. She didn't know him well enough yet to name it. He stood up. He was taller than she'd calculated. He walked to the window that looked out over the yard, the barn, the stretch of land beyond that rolled toward what she'd later learn was the disputed north pasture. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, and she got the distinct impression that he was having some kind of internal argument with himself, and she was not privy to either side. When he turned around, his expression had settled into something decided. "There's something I need," he said. "It's not a normal job. Tell me. It would require something from you that I have no right to ask." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." Preston Blackwood put both hands flat on the desk, leaned forward slightly, and said it plainly, the way he seemed to say everything. "I need a wife. By sunset today. Or I lose this land." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Magnolia Winters had heard in 11 days of travel. She stared at him. He stared back. No apology in it, but no arrogance either. Just a man laying out a problem. "That's not a job," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "It's not." "That's—" She stopped. Started again. "You're a stranger." "I know that." "I walked in here 3 minutes ago." "I know that too." She felt something that might have been laughter starting somewhere near her sternum, but it didn't make it all the way to her face because the situation was too strange and she was too tired and her feet hurt too much for anything to be purely funny. Why? She asked. Why today? Why by sunset? He pulled one of the circled papers from the stack on the desk and turned it toward her. She leaned in. It was a government land document, a homestead claim certificate, or the preliminary form of one. She knew enough of her father's struggles with land paperwork to recognize the type. The Homestead Act requires that the claimant be an established resident, Preston said. An established resident with dependents specifically for the land parcel I'm trying to secure, the North Pasture. 40 acres on the western edge of this property that my father broke his back trying to claim before he started again. A county land agent is coming to this property tomorrow to do an official inspection. If I'm a single man living alone out here, I can't prove established residency under the terms of this specific claim. And if you have a wife, then I have a family home, not just a working ranch. She looked at the map, at the circled section, at the red ink marking what was clearly something he'd been fighting for. What happened to your father? A muscle tightened along his jaw. He's gone. She understood from the way he said it that gone meant more than just dead. And if I refuse, she asked, then you walk out that door and I figure something else out, he said. I'm not going to stop you. She turned away from the desk, walked to the window he'd stood at before. Outside, the ranch hands had gone back to work. Mostly. One of them was still watching the house. Older man, weathered face, a look she couldn't read. 43 cents, one dress. A satchel containing a ledger she had no use for anymore, and a photograph of her parents from before everything started going wrong. She thought about the woman sweeping her porch back in town. Watch yourself. She thought about her father in his chair by the window, too proud and too tired and finally just too done. She thought about what it meant to have nowhere to go and how different that felt from having chosen to be somewhere. What does this arrangement look like? She asked without turning around. The day after the land agent comes. What happens then? You'd have a roof, he said. Work on the ranch. Real work, the kind you described. Room, board, wages. And the marriage? Legal, he said. Real, on paper. What it looks like after that, I suppose that's up to both of us. She turned around. I want one thing clear. All right. If I do this, I'm not decoration. I'm not a signature on a document. If I'm here, I'm working, and I'm owed the same respect as any person you employ. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, I'd expect nothing less. And I want it in writing, she added. Whatever you're promising me today. I want it written down and signed before we go anywhere near a minister or a justice of the peace. Something shifted in his expression. If she'd known him better, she might have called it respect. Since she didn't know him at all, she filed it away as something to be determined. Fair, he said. Magnolia Winters looked at the stranger across the desk, at the papers and the maps and the worn edges of everything in that room that told her this was a man who had been fighting for something a long time. She thought about what her mother used to say. The safest harbor is the one you find yourself, not the one someone hands you. She took a breath. Then write it down, she said, and after that, tell me where to find a minister. The justice of the peace in Cutter's Creek was a man named Aldous Webb, who was 64 years old, half-deaf in his right ear, and deeply unbothered by being dragged out of his supper at 4:30 in the afternoon to perform an emergency marriage ceremony for two people who clearly didn't know each other well enough to know each other's middle names. You willing? He asked Magnolia, peering at her over reading spectacles. I am, she said. You willing? He asked Preston. I am, Preston said. Then you're married, Aldous Webb said, and signed the paper with the kind of finality that suggested he'd done stranger things. That'll be $2. Preston paid it. They walked out of the Justice of the Peace's office into the late afternoon light, and Magnolia Winters, now Magnolia Blackwood, legally, on paper, in the eyes of Arizona Territory, looked at the man standing beside her and thought, I don't know a single thing about you. Then she looked at the horizon, at the particular orange-red of an Arizona sunset that she'd never seen before, so different from Ohio's softer colors, almost violent in its beauty. And she thought, I suppose I'm about to find out. Preston Blackwood said nothing for a moment. Then, You didn't ask me if I was dangerous. Are you? Not to you. Then it's not the first thing I need to know, she said. He almost smiled at that. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared, the way smoke goes before you're sure you saw it. They started back toward Broken Spur. Neither of them had any idea what they'd started, but the sun was still going down, and the land stretched out ahead of them, and somewhere on the western edge of that land, 40 acres waited, acres that men had lied for, stolen for, and one man had already lost his life trying to hold. Magnolia didn't know any of that yet. She was about to learn all of it. The ride back to Broken Spur Ranch took 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke for most of it. That wasn't unusual for Preston Blackwood. The ranch hands could have told her that, if she'd known to ask. He was a man who treated silence the way other men treated conversation, like it was the natural state of things and noise was the interruption. But for Magnolia, riding beside a man whose last name she'd just taken, whose face she'd known for less than 3 hours, the quiet had a different weight. It pressed on her from all sides. She kept her eyes on the road and her hands steady on the reins of the borrowed mare, and told herself that she had made a calculated decision, not a desperate one, and that those two things were different. She was not entirely sure she believed that yet. The first sign that life at Broken Spur was going to be complicated came before they even dismounted. There were 3 ranch hands waiting in the yard when they rode in, and the way they were standing, not working, just standing, arms crossed, watching, told Magnolia that word had already traveled faster than horses. In small places, it always did. The oldest of them, the weathered man she'd seen watching the house earlier, stepped forward as Preston swung down from the saddle. "You did it," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Preston said. The old man looked at Magnolia. His name, she'd learn in the next 10 minutes, was Walt Greer. 61 years old, had worked Broken Spur since before Preston's father built the second barn, and had a face like old boot leather and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he isn't sure about yet. Not unkind, just honest. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said back, because she'd already decided that the fastest way to lose the respect of men like this was to wait for them to offer it. Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. Just a fraction." The other 2 hands, younger, one barely old enough to shave properly, exchanged a glance that Magnolia clocked immediately, the kind of glance that meant they'd been talking about this before she arrived and had not come to any settled conclusion. "House is as you left it," Walt said to Preston. "Good." Preston handed off his horse to the younger of the 2 hands without looking at him. Then he turned to Magnolia. "I'll show you the room." "Before that," she said, "can you tell me where the household accounts are kept?" Preston stopped, turned. "The what?" "The ledgers. Supply costs, payroll records, outstanding debts." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. "If I'm going to be useful here, I need to understand what I'm working with." Walt Greer made a sound that might have been a laugh. He covered it with a cough. "Desk in the back room," Preston said after a moment. "I'll find them." "Thank you." She followed him inside by. The back room was less of an office and more of a place where paperwork went to lose hope. There were ledgers, yes. 3 of them, stacked under what appeared to be a broken bridle that hadn't been fixed yet, and a coffee mug with no handle. There were loose receipts folded into each other with no apparent organizing principle. There was a calendar on the wall from 2 years ago that someone had kept using by writing in the margins. Magnolia sat down at the small table, moved the bridle to the floor, and opened the first ledger. Preston watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "I'm not tired," she said. This was not entirely true. She was exhausted down to the marrow. But sitting still with nothing to do had always felt worse than working, and right now she needed her hands occupied so her mind couldn't run too far ahead of itself. "Suit yourself," he said, and left. She spent the next 2 hours going through the books. What she found was not catastrophic. It was, however, a slow-motion disaster of the kind that happens when a man is so focused on fighting one battle that he hasn't noticed 3 others developing around his flanks. The ranch was profitable, or should have been. The cattle operation was sound. Walt Greer clearly knew what he was doing with the livestock side of things. But the supplier accounts were a mess of uncollected discounts and overpayments. The payroll records had a gap of 4 months that appeared to have been managed by Preston writing individual notes to each hand, none of which were recorded anywhere. And there was a line item that repeated quarterly, described only as B admin fee, that she couldn't make sense of at all. She circled it, underlined it, set the ledger aside. Outside, she could hear the ranch settling into evening, the sounds of the animals, the distant voices of the hands, the particular creak that old wooden buildings make when the temperature drops. The smell of something cooking drifted through from what she assumed was a kitchen somewhere. She hadn't eaten since morning. A piece of hard bread, half a cup of water from a creek she wasn't sure about. She closed the ledger and went to find the kitchen. Well, it was Walt who was cooking. This surprised her. She'd expected a cook fire maybe, or someone's wife from town who came in. Not the ranch foreman standing at a cast iron stove with his sleeves rolled up, managing what appeared to be a respectable beef stew with an efficiency that suggested this was not a new arrangement. He didn't look up when she came in. "Figured you hadn't eaten," he said. "I haven't," she admitted. "Sit down then." He nodded at the kitchen table. It was a long table meant for more people than were currently at the ranch. She sat at one end, and after a minute, Walt set a bowl in front of her and a piece of cornbread and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She ate. She tried not to eat too fast and mostly failed. Walt sat across from her with his own bowl and said nothing for a few minutes. Just ate. She appreciated that. People who filled silence by talking at you while you were hungry were a particular kind of tiresome. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone more frightened." "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not showing it." He looked at her. "Fair enough?" He broke off a piece of cornbread. "How much do you know about this situation? The land situation?" "Almost nothing," she said. "Preston, Mr. Blackwood, explained the homestead claim requirement, that's all." Walt was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something behind it. "The North Pasture's been contested going on 6 years now," he said. "Preston's father, James Blackwood, broke that land himself. Built a cabin on it. Had it almost filed proper before—" He stopped. "There was a fire, 7 years ago. Burned the original homestead cabin to the ground. James Blackwood made it out, but not by much. Lost all his documentation, deed records, the claim papers, everything." Magnolia set down her spoon. "That's not an accident." Walt's eyes were steady on hers. "No," he said. "It's not." "Who?" He picked up his coffee, took a long drink. "That," he said carefully, "is something Preston would rather tell you himself, if he's going to tell you at all." She understood that she'd just hit a wall and that pushing on it tonight would accomplish nothing, so she went around it. "The quarterly charge in the ledger," she said, "described as B admin fee. Can you tell me what that is?" Walt's hand tightened slightly around his mug. She caught it. "That's something else Preston needs to explain," he said. "But I'll tell you this much. You were right to underline it." She slept that night in a room on the second floor that was clean and bare and smelled like cedar and old wood. There was a bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the yard. Someone, Walt, she guessed, had put a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. She lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the fire and the quarterly charge and the land agent who was coming tomorrow and the man sleeping somewhere on the other side of this wall who was now, legally, her husband. Then she fell asleep the way exhausted people do, all at once, like a light going out. She dreamed about Ohio, about her father's chair by the window, empty, about the way the house had looked when the creditors came, smaller somehow, like it had given up trying to be a home. She woke before sunrise to the sound of horses. The land agent's name was Clifford Marsh, and he arrived at 7 in the morning sharp, which told Magnolia something about him before she'd seen his face. Men who arrived exactly on time to other people's property were either very professional or very eager to catch someone unprepared. Sometimes both. He was younger than she'd expected, 35 maybe, well-dressed for the territory, with a coat that hadn't spent enough time outdoors and boots that were too clean. He carried a leather case and had the practiced smile of a man who had learned that seeming pleasant was useful regardless of his actual intentions. Preston met him at the gate. Magnolia stood 2 steps behind Preston and slightly to his left, which was exactly where she'd decided to position herself. Close enough to be clearly present, far enough not to seem like she was hiding behind him. Marsh's eyes went to her immediately. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he said, with a slight lift of the eyebrow that suggested he'd been given some information in advance. "Yes," she said. "And when did you arrive at Broken Spur?" "Some time ago," she said pleasantly, which was technically true since she'd arrived yesterday, And yesterday was indeed some time ago. She watched his face to see if he'd push on it. He didn't. Not yet. The inspection took 3 hours. Marsh walked the house with his leather case open, making notes. He looked at the kitchen. She'd been up since 5:30 making sure it looked lived in, which wasn't hard since it was lived in, but she'd also made sure there was bread rising and coffee on and her own few belongings visible on the shelf she'd cleared. He looked at the sleeping rooms. He walked the yard, the barn, asked questions of the ranch hands with the careful manner of a man who knew he might get coached answers and was trying to find the gaps. Walt Greer, when asked how long the lady of the house had been in residence, said, "Long enough to reorganize the supply ledgers," which was completely accurate and also managed to be slightly misleading in exactly the right direction, and Magnolia made a mental note to thank him later. Marsh saved the north pasture for last. He walked it himself, all 40 acres, with Preston alongside and Magnolia keeping pace on the other side. It was good land. She could see that even with no experience in ranching. The grass came back differently there, richer, darker green in the low spots. A creek ran along the eastern edge. It was the kind of land that would matter more in 10 years than it did now, which meant it was exactly the kind of land that men were willing to do ugly things to get hold of. Marsh knelt at one point and examined the soil, wrote something in his case, stood up and looked northwest, toward where the Bates property line ran. "You're aware," Marsh said, not quite to Preston and not quite to the heir, "that there's a competing claim filed on this parcel." "I'm aware," Preston said, "filed by Harlan Bates, claiming that this land was never properly settled under your father's original application." "My father settled this land. The original documentation was destroyed in a fire. I've spent 3 years rebuilding the evidentiary record." Marsh turned, looked at Preston with the careful expression of a man holding something and deciding whether to put it down. "Mr. Bates has also filed a statement suggesting that the current residential claim may be irregular." The word landed like a rock on still water. The ripples went out fast. Preston's jaw tightened. Magnolia felt the shift in him, the way a person's whole posture changes when they're fighting to keep their voice level. She stepped forward. "Mr. Marsh," she said, keeping her tone even and cooperative, the voice she'd used with suppliers in Ohio who tried to overcharge her father, pleasant and immovable at the same time. "What specifically does Mr. Bates's statement allege?" Marsh looked at her. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. She'd surprised him by engaging directly, which told her he hadn't expected her to. "It suggests," he said carefully, "that the residential arrangement here may be recent, contrived." "I see." She held his gaze. "And is a competing landowner's unsupported opinion a relevant factor in a homestead inspection under the 1862 Act?" A small silence. "You know land law," Marsh said. "My father dealt with homestead claims in Ohio," she said. "I kept his records." Both of these things were true. Marsh looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Preston. Then he closed his leather case with a small, decisive snap. "I'll file my report within the week," he said. "The claim will be reviewed by the District Land Office in Phoenix." "We look forward to the review," Preston said. Marsh walked back toward his horse. When he was far enough away, Preston exhaled, just once, sharp, like he'd been holding it for 3 hours. Because he had been. "You didn't tell me Bates had filed a statement," Magnolia said quietly. "I didn't know until just now." She looked at him. At the side of his face, which was still carefully arranged into something that didn't show what was behind it. "He's trying to sabotage the inspection." "Yes. Has he done this before? Interfered with the claim?" Preston was quiet for a moment, looking out over the north pasture the way a man looks at something he's afraid of losing. "He's done a lot of things before," he said. "Some of them I can prove, some of them I can't." She waited. He turned to look at her. "The fire I mentioned. My father's original homestead cabin. I know who set it. I've known for 4 years. I just can't prove it yet." She held his gaze. "Bates." "His men," Preston said, "which is the same thing." The wind came off the pasture and moved between them, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Magnolia thought about the admin fee in the ledger, circled in pencil, waiting. "Tell me about the quarterly charge," she said. His expression changed. Closed down, then opened again, like a door swinging both ways. "Where did you see that?" "In the ledger, last night." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, 2 years ago, when I was first filing the rebuilt claim, a man came to me, said he worked adjacent to the land office, said he could smooth things along, make sure the paperwork was processed correctly, nothing got lost or misfiled. She understood where this was going and felt cold. You paid him. I paid him. The words came out flat with self-disgust. For 8 months. Until I figured out that nothing he claimed to be smoothing was ever at risk in the first place. It was a shakedown. By the time I understood that, he'd disappeared, and I had no way to know how much, if any, of what he'd told me had gone back to Bates. Magnolia pressed her hands together, thought carefully. Do you have the receipts? The payments? I have the ledger entries. That's something, she said. It's leverage, potentially, if this man ever surfaces. It documents that someone tried to compromise your claim through extortion. She paused. We need to figure out who B is. Preston looked at her. We, he said. Not like a challenge. More like someone testing a word they weren't sure they'd heard correctly. We, she confirmed. Unless you'd prefer to sort this out on your own while I go rearrange the kitchen shelves. This time the almost smile made it a fraction further across his face. It still didn't fully arrive, but it was closer. No, he said. I wouldn't prefer that. The weeks that followed were the kind that don't announce themselves as important while you're living through them. They don't feel like anything except hard work and short nights, and the specific exhaustion of learning something new every single day. It was only later, much later, that Magnolia would look back at those weeks and understand that they were the foundation of everything. She threw herself into the ranch accounts with the focus of someone who needed to not think about what she'd done. Not because she regretted it, she wasn't sure she regretted it, but because the full weight of it hadn't settled yet, and she knew from experience that things you haven't fully processed yet have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Better to be occupied. Better to be useful. The supply situation alone took her a week to untangle. She found 3 vendors overcharging on a regular basis. Not dramatically, but consistently, the kind of small theft that adds up over years to something significant. She wrote letters. She was polite. She was specific. 2 of the vendors corrected the charges immediately. The third one she dropped entirely and found a replacement in Tucson who cost less and delivered faster. Walt watched all of this without comment. But one morning, he set a second cup of coffee on the table next to her ledger work without being asked, and that, she'd come to understand, was his version of a significant endorsement. The ranch hands were a more complicated calculation. There were 4 of them in total. Walt, who was the foreman and effectively the spine of the whole operation. Denny Cole, 23, who was a genuinely skilled horseman and deeply suspicious of Magnolia for no reason he seemed able to articulate beyond she wasn't what he expected. Hector Ramirez, 31, quiet and reliable, and the person who actually knew the most about the cattle operation's practical day-to-day, who accepted Magnolia's presence with the pragmatic indifference of a man who'd learned that most things that seemed strange at first turned out to be ordinary after a week. And a fourth hand named Thomas, who'd worked at Broken Spur for 6 months, and whose last name Magnolia couldn't find in any of the payroll records, which was something she quietly flagged for later. Denny's problem came to a head on the 8th day. She'd been working in the barn, not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd gone to check on a mare that Walt had mentioned was favoring her left foreleg, and then she'd ended up staying to help with the feeding because it was the obvious thing to do when you're standing right there and there's work to be done. Denny came in mid-afternoon, saw her stacking feed sacks in a methodical way that was apparently not the way he preferred the feed sacks to be stacked, and said something under his breath that he didn't intend for her to hear. She heard it. She set down the feed sack she was holding, turned around, and looked at him directly. I'm going to need you to say that out loud, she said, since you've been thinking it for over a week. Denny went red. He was young enough that he still did that. I didn't say anything. You did, and I'd rather have it said to my face than spoken at my back for the next 6 months. She kept her voice level, not aggressive, just clear. We're going to be working alongside each other for a while. That works better when people are direct. Denny's jaw worked for a moment. Then, I don't think you belong here, he said. I think Preston made a crazy decision, and you took advantage of it, and nobody knows anything about you. That's fair, she said. He blinked. He'd been expecting a fight, and she'd just agreed with him, which is a harder thing to respond to. What? Most of that is fair, she said. You don't know me. I've been here 8 days. Your concern for Preston and for this ranch makes sense. She picked up the feed sack again. Here's what I'll say in response. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to get in your way. And I'm going to do the work I said I'd do, and you can judge me by that, or you can keep making up your mind in advance. Either way, these sacks need stacking. She went back to stacking them. There was a long silence. Then the sound of Denny picking up a sack and falling into a working rhythm beside her. He didn't apologize. She didn't need him to. It was better than an apology. It was a decision. It was on the 14th day that she first saw Harlan Bates. She'd ridden into Cutter's Creek with Walt to pick up a supply order, properly this time, on a good horse, with actual money for actual supplies. The Bates name she'd been hearing in fragments and sideways references for 2 weeks, never quite fully, always with something held back. She'd built up a picture of him from pieces, wealthy, older, had been in the territory a long time, had a way of operating that used legal mechanisms the way other men used fists. She did not expect him to be waiting outside the general store. He was in his 60s, and he looked like money that had curdled into something harder over time. Big man. Not tall exactly, but solid in the way that takes up space beyond just physical dimensions. He was well-dressed, which in this context meant that his clothing said, "I don't do the dirty work myself." He was standing with 2 other men whose job it appeared to be to stand with Harlan Bates, and looked like the kind of men you'd prefer not to have a problem with. He looked at Magnolia with an expression that was calibrated to seem genial and wasn't. "You must be the new Mrs. Blackwood," he said. The word "new" did a specific amount of work in that sentence. "I am," she said. She didn't offer her hand. "Harlan Bates." He offered his. "I'm a neighbor of your husband's." She shook his hand briefly because refusing would have been a tell. "I've heard your name," she said. "Only good things, I hope." His smile stayed right where he'd put it. "I wanted to introduce myself, and to say, without any hostility intended, that I hope you and your husband understand the situation with that land parcel clearly. It would be a shame for a young woman like yourself to get tangled up in something that's been contentious a long time." She looked at him. "I appreciate the concern," she said, "though I'd say I'm fairly well tangled already, given that I live there." Something moved in his eyes. Just briefly. Not anger, something more controlled than anger, something that was thinking. "The North Pasture," he said, almost conversationally, "has been in dispute for some time. There are competing claims. Reasonable people might say that the Blackwood claim is not the strongest one. Reasonable people might say all kinds of things," she said pleasantly. "What do the documents say?" He studied her. The genial expression was still in place, but there was something underneath it working hard. "You're not from here," he said. "No. Arizona's hard on people who aren't from here." She looked at him steadily. "Ohio was hard on people too," she said. "I managed." Walt beside her made no expression whatsoever, which was his most eloquent mode. Bates nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. "Give my regards to your husband," he said, and stepped aside to let them pass. She didn't let herself look back until they were inside the store. Walt picked up a box of nails and handed it to her. "Well," he said quietly, "he'll be making a different kind of move now." "Because I didn't back down." "Because he wasn't expecting someone like you," Walt said. "He'd planned for a frightened girl who needed managing. He's going to have to rethink his approach." Magnolia set the box of nails in the supply basket. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was slightly less so, but that was an internal matter. "Good," she said. "Let him rethink." She told Preston about the encounter that evening. They'd fallen into a habit, the 2 of them, of talking in the evening. It had started practically. She'd report on the accounts. He'd tell her what was happening with the cattle operation or the land claim progress. And it had evolved into something slightly less defined. They sat on the porch most evenings, the 2 of them with coffee, the sky going through its extraordinary southwestern colors above them, and talked about the ranch, about what needed doing, about what worried them, about occasionally things that had nothing to do with Broken Spur at all. She'd learned bit by bit who Preston Blackwood was under the controlled exterior. He was not a man who was naturally cold. He was a man who had learned to be careful, which is a different thing entirely. He'd grown up on this land, had watched his father fight for it, had been 17 years old when the fire took everything, and had spent the 12 years since trying to build it back. He had a specific kind of humor, dry, quiet, the kind you had to be paying attention to catch, that surfaced when he was comfortable. He was harder on himself than he was on anyone around him. He kept things to himself past the point where keeping things was useful, which was something she recognized because she did the same thing. When she told him about Bates outside the general store, Preston went still in the particular way that he went still when something had made him angry and he was managing it. "He approached you directly," he said. "He was waiting outside the store." Preston set down his coffee cup. Set it down carefully, which somehow was more alarming than if he'd set it down hard. "He's never done that before," he said. "He's always worked through other channels." "He wanted to look at me," she said. "Evaluate whether I was a problem." "And?" "I think he decided I might be," she said, "which means he's going to try something different." Preston was quiet for a moment. The evening light was going red-orange, and the land was doing what land does in that light, which is look both more beautiful and more consequential than it does in the flat of day. "I should have told you more," he said, "before the inspection, before any of this. I kept it close. The history with Bates." "I understand why," she said. "Because she did. You didn't tell everything to someone you'd known for 3 hours. You told it slowly, as trust accrued, as you figured out whether the person in front of you was going to hold what you gave them carefully or use it against you." "There's more than the fire," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "I'll tell you," he said, "all of it, but I need a day to figure out where to start." She nodded. "Take the time," she said, "but don't take too long." He looked out at the pasture, at the 40 acres that sat to the west, darker against the sky now, the creek line visible as a shadow along the edge. "Walt likes you," he said, which was a significant non sequitur. "Walt tolerates me," she said. "For Walt, those are the same thing," Preston said. And this time, the almost smile made it all the way. It arrived, briefly but completely, and changed his whole face. She thought, there he is, the person under all the armor. Just a glimpse, but real. She thought, I'm going to need to be careful about this. She was right about that. But the warning arrived too late, or maybe just late enough to matter in a different way than she intended, because something had already shifted between them over these 2 weeks. Something that had nothing to do with land claims or legal documents or survival arrangements, something that was quieter and more persistent than any of that. And it had started, she would realize later, on the very first evening she sat across from this man and told him she wanted everything in writing. It started maybe the moment she decided he was worth fighting alongside. That was the thought she carried inside with her when she finally said goodnight and went back to her ledgers. Outside, the north pasture sat in the dark, patient and contested, and full of everything that was coming. Neither of them knew yet what Harlan Bates was planning next. Neither of them knew what the land office in Phoenix would decide. Neither of them knew how close things were going to get before they got better. But the accounts were in order. The supply costs were down 11%. Walt had put a second coffee cup on the table without being asked for 3 days running. And somewhere between the practical and the personal, without announcing itself, something had taken root in the hardscrabble ground of Broken Spur Ranch that was going to be much harder to uproot than 40 acres of contested pasture land. Preston kept his word about telling her everything. He waited one day, exactly as he'd said, and then on the evening of the 15th day, he came to the back room where she was working, sat down across from her at the small table, and told her all of it. He didn't make it dramatic. That wasn't his way. He told it the way a man recounts something he's gone over so many times in his own head that the telling has worn smooth, the way river stones go smooth. The rough edges are still there underneath. You just can't see them anymore unless you know where to look. Harlan Bates had come to the Arizona Territory in 1871, 14 years before Magnolia arrived at Broken Spur. He'd come with money from somewhere back east. Nobody was entirely sure where, and the people who'd asked had eventually stopped asking. And he'd bought land strategically, not randomly. He wasn't a rancher by instinct or by love of the work. He was an accumulator. He bought parcels that connected to other parcels, built relationships with county officials, learned which levers moved things in Phoenix and which moved things locally, and over a decade had assembled one of the largest land holdings in that part of the territory. James Blackwood, Preston's father, had been in the territory longer. He was there before Bates, had broken land with his own hands, had built something genuine and modest and real. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't a political man. He was a rancher the way some people are simply what they are, completely, without ambiguity. He'd filed the homestead claim on the North Pasture legally, properly, through the correct channels in 1875. What he hadn't counted on was that the North Pasture sat between two of Bates's existing holdings, a 40-acre gap in what Bates had intended to be a continuous block, a splinter in his plan. Bates had offered to buy it twice. James Blackwood had declined twice. He wasn't being difficult. He simply needed that pasture. It was the water access. The creek along the eastern edge fed the whole western operation of Broken Spur. Without it, the ranch contracted to something that could survive but not grow, and James Blackwood had built this place to grow. So Bates had taken a different approach. The fire in 1878 had started in the middle of the night in a cabin that sat on the North Pasture itself, the original homestead structure that James had built to establish physical residency as required by the claim. By the time anyone reached it, there was nothing left. The documentation that James had stored there, copies of his original claim filing, land survey records, correspondence with the land office, was ash. James Blackwood had survived because he'd woken at the smell of smoke and gone out a window. He was 61 years old, and the drop from the window had broken 2 ribs. He'd landed in the dirt outside his burning cabin and watched 12 years of careful work disappear in 40 minutes. He'd rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, gathering what records he could from the land office itself, from the county seat, from people who'd been witnesses to his original surveys. It had taken him 4 years to reassemble enough documentation to refile the claim. Then he died, heart failure, in the spring of 1882, with the refiled claim still pending and the North Pasture still in dispute. Preston had been 25 when his father died. He'd been working the ranch alongside James for 7 years, had understood every dimension of the land dispute, had watched his father age 20 years in the decade after the fire. He'd taken over the refiling process with the particular ferocity of a man who doesn't have grief figured out, and so turns it into something he can do with his hands. "I knew it was Bates," Preston said. "I knew it within a month of the fire. There was a man, one of Bates's hands, named Cutter, who'd been seen on the road near the North Pasture the week before. Not unusual by itself. But after the fire, Cutter left Bates's employment and disappeared from the territory entirely, which is a specific kind of coincidence." "Did you ever find him?" Magnolia asked. "No." Preston's hands were flat on the table. He had a habit, she'd noticed, of pressing his palms down when he was containing something. "I've looked. Off and on for 3 years? Nothing." "So you have the pattern, but not the proof." "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "And Bates knows you can't prove it." "He's been banking on that for years," Preston said. "The competing claim he filed on the North Pasture. When did that happen?" 6 months after my father died. The timing was not a coincidence, and both of them knew it. He waited until I was dealing with the estate, the paperwork, all of it, and then he filed. Claimed that my father's original homestead cabin had never constituted valid occupancy because it burned before the claim period completed. "That's legally questionable," she said. "It's legally wrong," Preston said. "But wrong and legally wrong are 2 different things, and wrong and provably wrong are 2 different things again, and Bates has spent 6 years using that space between them." Magnolia thought about the quarterly ledger charge, about the man who'd come to Preston claiming to smooth things at the land office. "The person who approached you about the admin fee," she said. "Did he ever give you a name?" "Said his name was Beaumont. I can't find any record of a Clifford Beaumont ever working in or adjacent to the land office here or in Phoenix. Not Beaumont. Maybe not the last name at all." "Could it be a first initial?" she asked. Preston looked at her. "I went back and looked at it 2 different ways," he said. "Nothing landed." "I want to try something," she said. "I want to write to the Phoenix land office directly. Not about the claim, just requesting a list of all administrative personnel associated with the district between 1882 and now. It's public record, and they have to provide it." He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, which was slightly longer than necessary, like he was recalibrating something. You think Beaumont is a real person who actually works there? I think someone who knew enough about the claim process to make you believe his offer was plausible, either worked there or worked closely with someone who did, she said. And I think there's a chance that person is still working there, which means Bates may have had eyes on your claim filing this whole time. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Write the letter, Preston said. What? The letter went out the next morning. It would take time. Correspondence to Phoenix moved at the pace of available stages, which was not fast. But it was moving, and moving was different from standing still. And Magnolia had learned early in life that the way you survive a slow disaster is to keep doing the next small thing without stopping to calculate how far you have left to go. In the meantime, the ranch had its own demands. October arrived with a temperature drop that was more abrupt than what she'd been used to in Ohio, the desert having apparently decided that the transition between seasons was a personal inconvenience rather than a natural process. She'd added a second blanket to her bed by the first week of the month. She'd also, quietly, begun keeping a small fire going in the back room in the evenings, which was where she did most of her work. And Preston had come in one night to tell her something about the supply run, and had stopped at the doorway looking at the fire with an expression she couldn't fully read. "My mother used to keep a fire in this room," he said. She hadn't known there was a mother, or rather, she'd known there must have been, but the subject had never come up. "She's gone?" Magnolia asked. "Since I was 9, he said. "Fever." He didn't say anything else about it. He told her what he'd come to tell her about the supply run, and then he left. But for a moment before he turned to go, she'd seen it. The specific loneliness of a person who has been without a home inside a house for a very long time. It was a thing she recognized. She recognized it because she'd been carrying it herself. It was Walt who first told her about the cattle situation, and he told her sideways, which was his preferred method of communicating anything important. They were in the barn one morning, 11 days into October, and he was checking one of the older cows for a hoof problem he was worried about, and he said, without looking up from the hoof, "You notice anything unusual about the North Pasture head count this week?" Magnolia had been helping with feeding. She stopped. "I haven't done the head count," she said. "That's been Hector's job." "I know it has," Walt said. She understood what he was saying without him saying it. "How many?" "4 head, over 2 weeks." Walt set the hoof down carefully. "It could be something natural. A fence break, strays, happens." He paused. "But the fence on the North Pasture is not broken." "You checked it." "Denny and I walked the whole line yesterday." He stood up, his knees making a sound that suggested they were registering a formal complaint. "Animals don't disappear through a whole fence." "Has this happened before?" she asked. "Not in the 4 years I've been at Broken Spur," Walt said. "And not the 3 years before that when I was hearing about this place from James Blackwood." She was quiet. 4 head of cattle over 2 weeks wasn't financial ruin, but it was a message, the kind of message that came without a signature. "We need to tell Preston," she said. "He's going to want to handle it himself," Walt said, "the way he handles most things." "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." She told Preston herself that same evening, before Walt had a chance to. She'd decided she was done waiting for the right moment to say hard things. There was no right moment. There was just the moment you were standing in. Preston's response was exactly what Walt had predicted. His jaw tightened and his hands went flat, and he said he'd ride the fence line himself in the morning. "Walt already rode it," she said. "The fence is intact." "Then I'll ride the pasture." "Preston." She waited until he looked at her. "Someone is taking your cattle off that pasture, through a fence that isn't broken, which means they're doing it in a deliberate way that leaves no obvious evidence. That's not a fence problem. That's a people problem." He knew that. She could see that he knew that. What he was doing was not the same as not knowing. It was the older, more stubborn thing of a man whose instinct is to go look at the physical problem with his own eyes, because that is the one thing he can do that feels like control. "I know," he said. "So don't just ride the pasture," she said. "Think about who has access to that area, who knows the cattle patterns, who knows when the hands are occupied elsewhere." "Anyone who's watched this ranch for long enough," he said, "which Bates has." "Or someone Bates is paying," she said. "Someone closer." This was the thing neither of them had said yet, and she felt it land between them, and she watched Preston absorb it. The possibility that someone on the ranch, or close enough to know the ranch's rhythms, was feeding information outward. Thomas, he said, the hand with no last name in the payroll records. She'd been thinking it for 2 weeks. I don't know, she said carefully. I don't want to accuse someone without more than a gut feeling, but I'd like to know more about him. He came through about 6 months ago, Preston said, showed up looking for work, came with a reference letter from a ranch east of Tucson. I hired him without checking the reference because it was spring and I needed the hands. Can we check it now? He nodded slowly. I'll send a wire to the ranch in Tucson tomorrow. Quietly, she said. Quietly, he agreed. There was a pause. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming off the desert in that particular cold October way, and somewhere out in the dark, the cattle in the main pasture were doing the restless sound they made when the temperature dropped fast. Magnolia, he said. The way he said her name had changed over 3 weeks without either of them acknowledging it. At the beginning, he'd said it like a practical identification. This is who I'm addressing. Now it had something different in it, something more deliberate. She'd noticed. She hadn't commented. What? I need you to know that this isn't. I didn't bring you into this expecting it to get complicated. The arrangement was supposed to be straightforward. She looked at him. Was it? You told me about a contested land claim, a man you believe burned your father's cabin, and 6 years of legal maneuvering on day 2. That's not what straightforward looks like. He almost smiled. You're right. I'm aware, she said. What I'm telling you is that complicated doesn't change my position. I'm here. I said I would be, and I am. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. All right, he said. The wire response from Tucson came back in 4 days. There was no ranch east of Tucson by the name on Thomas's reference letter. There never had been. Preston showed Magnolia the telegram at the breakfast table, sliding it across the wood toward her without preamble, which was how he communicated things he was unhappy about. She read it, folded it, slid it back. Don't let him know we checked, she said immediately. I know. If he's passing information to Bates, we can use that. We let him think everything here is normal, and we control what he sees. Preston was quiet, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I want him off this ranch. I know you do. She understood that. It was a betrayal, or close enough to one. A man who'd eaten at this table, slept in the bunkhouse, taken Preston's wages, while reporting back to the man trying to take his land. But if we push him out now, Bates knows we've found a leak, and he closes up and finds another way we can't see. If Thomas stays, we know where Bates's information is coming from. Preston looked at her. You're asking me to keep a man on payroll who is possibly working against us. I'm asking you to be patient for a little while longer, she said. Feed him information we choose, nothing real. And watch what moves on Bates's side as a result. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see the cost of it on his face. The man who dealt in direct action being asked to play a longer, slower, more indirect game. How long? He asked. Until we know what Bates is planning next, she said. He exhaled through his nose. Fine. What Bates was planning next arrived not through Thomas, but through a lawyer. His name was Rupert Gale, and he appeared at Broken Spur on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning 3 weeks into October, riding a horse that was too good for him and carrying a briefcase that was too formal for the territory. He asked for Preston Blackwood and was shown to the porch, where Magnolia happened to also be sitting with a cup of coffee and the supply ledger, and she watched him take in the fact of her with the slight recalibration that men like this did when they encountered someone they hadn't planned for. Gale presented a document. He did it with the polished manner of someone who has delivered unpleasant news so many times that pleasantness has become a professional habit rather than a personal one. The document was a formal legal challenge to the Blackwood homestead claim, filed in Phoenix by Harlan Bates, alleging that the residential requirement had not been met under the terms of the 1862 Act because the current claimant's wife had not been in residence at the time of the inspection, and therefore the marriage could not be considered an established household. Magnolia read it while Gale was still explaining it. She read it twice. The argument was thin. It was thin in the specific way that Bates operated, not outright wrong, but exploiting a gap in language that could be argued in more than one direction. And the timing of it, coming now rather than before or during the inspection, suggested something specific. Bates had a source at the Phoenix Land Office who had told him that Clifford Marsh's inspection report had been favorable, and he was trying to preempt the approval before it came through. The information gap she'd been thinking about. It was real. Someone in Phoenix was feeding Bates the status of the claim. She set the document down. "Mr. Gale," she said, and both men looked at her. Gale with controlled surprise, Preston with a look that was becoming familiar to her, the look of a man who has learned to wait and see what she does next rather than stepping in front of it. Under the 1862 Act as amended in 1879, the residential requirement for a married claimant specifies that the claimant must maintain an established homestead, defined as a dwelling in continuous occupation by the claimant's household. The Act does not specify a date by which a spouse must have arrived to qualify as part of that household. Are you filing this challenge under the original Act or the amended version? Gale blinked. He had the expression of a man who has come to collect and found the till guarded. The original Act, then you'll want to be careful, she said, because the amendment materially changes the residential definition, and a challenge filed under the original Act's language against a claim that qualifies under the amended version is not just weak, it's potentially sanctionable. I'd suggest your client review which version applies before this moves further. Gale looked at Preston. Preston looked back at him with an expression that communicated nothing except that he was paying attention. "I'll relay your response," Gale said, with the practiced neutrality of a man who has just had to adjust his footing and doesn't want to show it. "Please do," Magnolia said. "And Mr. Gale, you can tell Mr. Bates that we received his communication and that we'll be responding formally through the Phoenix Land Office within the week, through the proper channels." Gale left. His horse's hooves went down the road, and the sound faded, and the morning resumed being quiet. Preston let out a long breath. "The amendment," he said. "Is that real?" "It's real," she said. "My father fought a boundary dispute in Ohio in 1879. I spent 2 months with those documents." She paused. "The challenge is thin, but it's going to require a formal response, and it's going to slow the approval process." "That's what he wants." "Yes," she said. "He doesn't need to win the legal challenge. He just needs to delay long enough to—" She stopped, worked through it. "What's the next deadline on the claim? The next date that matters?" Preston went still in the way that meant something had occurred to him that he didn't like. "November 30th, he said. "If the claim isn't approved by November 30th, it goes back into pending status and has to be refiled from the beginning. The competing claim Bates filed stays active. And the legal challenge he just filed buys him how long in the review process?" With the Phoenix office backlog, Preston stopped. 6 to 8 weeks. She did the math. It was October 22nd. 8 weeks from now was late December. The claim deadline was November 30th. The challenge, even if it ultimately failed, could push the review past the deadline by weeks. "He doesn't need to win," she said again, quietly this time. "He just needs to slow it down enough that the deadline passes." Preston stood up from his chair abruptly, walked to the porch railing, stood with his back to her for a moment. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the line of his spine, the specific posture of a man who is fighting very hard not to kick something. "I need to think," he said. "We need to think," she corrected. Not harshly, just accurately. He turned around. He looked at her standing there on his porch with his mother's satchel on her shoulder, and the legal challenge in her hand, this woman who had arrived 37 days ago with 43 cents and one dress, and something crossed his face that she had no category for yet. "We," he said, like the first time she'd used it and he'd tested the word, but different now, more settled. "We," she said. He came back to the table, sat down. "So how do we fight the delay?" "We don't fight the delay," she said. "We go around it. If the formal review process is going to run past November 30th, we find a way to get the claim approved before the challenge slows it down, which means we need someone at the Phoenix Land Office who will prioritize it." "I don't have those connections." "I know," she said, "but someone does." She thought about this for a moment. Who in Cutter's Creek has dealings in Phoenix? A businessman, a lawyer, someone who has had reason to work with the land office before? Preston thought. "Doc Halverson," he said. "He had a land dispute 2 years ago, settled it out of Phoenix." "Can he be trusted?" "About as far as anything goes out here," Preston said. "Which means mostly," with conditions. "I want to talk to him," she said. "Tomorrow." Preston nodded. There was a beat of silence between them, not the uncomfortable kind, the other kind, the kind that sits between two people who are thinking about the same thing from slightly different angles, and neither needs to explain it. "Magnolia," he said. She waited. "When you said you wanted everything in writing that first day, when you sat down in front of the ledgers before you'd even seen your room," he paused. "I was not a man who said difficult things easily, and she could see the effort of it. I didn't know what I was getting when I made that offer to you. I want you to know that I know that now." She looked at him. The evening was coming down outside, the sky starting its performance. "What does that mean?" she asked. Not defensively, just wanting to know what he meant precisely, because she had learned that when Preston Blackwood said something, it was worth hearing the exact version. "It means I'm grateful," he said, "and I don't say that to a lot of people, so I wanted to make sure I said it clearly." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her chest did a small, inconvenient thing. She put it aside for later, the way she'd been putting several things aside for later, in the growing collection of things she was not yet ready to examine. "You're welcome," she said. "Now let's figure out how to save your land." It was 2 days later, on the morning of the 24th of October, that Walt found her. She'd been in the barn early, a habit she'd developed, checking the horses before the hands were fully up, partly because it was useful, and partly because the barn at that hour was quiet in a way she found easier than most silences. Walt came in while she was checking the mare's repaired foreleg, and he came in fast, which was not his way, and she straightened up immediately. "What?" she said. "Thomas is gone," Walt said. "Bunkhouse is cleared out. His horse is gone too." She processed this. "When?" "Sometime in the night. Denny heard him up around 2 but figured he was using the outhouse." She thought fast. Thomas gone meant he'd been spooked. Something had told him his position was compromised, which meant either he'd noticed that Preston had been less forthcoming with information lately, or something else had shifted that she hadn't caught. Or, and this was the thought that came next, cold and specific, he'd finished whatever he'd been sent to do. "Wake Preston," she said. Walt was already moving. She went through the barn and out the back, walking fast toward the north pasture. The morning was gray and cold, the sun not fully up, the land still in that uncertain light that made distances hard to judge. She walked the fence line along the south side, checking it out of something she couldn't name yet, some instinct that had come from 37 days of watching this land and learning its rhythms. She found it 20 minutes later. Not a break in the fence, not what you'd see from a casual check. But along the southeast corner of the north pasture, someone had removed 3 fence posts at their bases. Not cut, removed, pulled from the ground, and then reset carefully, so they looked intact but were not actually fixed to anything. You could lift the whole section of fence like a gate. Animals moved through and the fence went back. Clever, methodical, patient. She stood there looking at it as the sun came up and the light hit the false fence posts, and she felt something that was cold and quiet and certain. Thomas hadn't just been passing information to Bates. He'd been moving their cattle out. Systematically. A few at a time, through a gap that could be reset invisibly. For weeks. And he'd run last night because his work was done, or because he knew they were close to catching him. Either way, he was gone, and someone needed to count the herd this morning with a completely honest number. Preston came up behind her. She heard him before she saw him, the specific sound of his boots on the dry ground. She pointed at the false fence post without turning around. He came forward, crouched, examined it. When he stood up, his face had gone very still in a different way than she'd seen before. Not controlled anger. Something deeper than that. "How many do you think?" he asked. His voice was level. "I don't know yet. We need a real head count." She paused. "But Preston, this is what Bates needed. It's not just harassment. The North Pasture needs a minimum cattle count to qualify as an active working homestead under the claim. If he's dropped our numbers below that threshold—" "I know," Preston said, very quietly. She turned to face him. In the early morning light, with the cold coming off the desert around them and the contested pasture behind her, she saw something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled exterior. Not the almost smile or the flat, careful voice. She saw the exhaustion underneath all of it. 12 years of fighting the same fight, the accumulated weight of it, the particular defeat of a man who has done everything right and keeps getting beaten by someone who is willing to do everything wrong. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, deliberate one, the kind that says I see it without requiring anything more. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "We're not done," she said. He held her gaze. Something passed through his expression that was complicated and real and not entirely sad. "No," he said. "We're not." Around them, the morning kept arriving, indifferent to their problems. The light spreading across the north pasture, the way it spread every morning, whether anyone was watching or not, turning the grass from gray to gold 1 slow degree at a time. The head count came back 2 hours later. 18 head short. Enough, if Bates had calculated correctly, to push the active livestock threshold below what the claim required. Magnolia sat with the number for 10 minutes. Then she picked up her pen. She had letters to write, and she had exactly 37 days until November 30th. And she was not, under any circumstances, going to let Harlan Bates take one more thing from this ranch, or from the man who had spent his whole adult life trying to hold it together. She wrote the first letter to the Phoenix Land Office, the second to a livestock commissioner she'd found referenced in the county records, the third to Doc Halverson, requesting a meeting that afternoon, and the fourth, the one that took her longest, the one she drafted 3 times before she got it right, to the Arizona Territory Sheriff's Office in Tucson, describing in careful and specific terms the evidence of systematic livestock removal from a contested homestead claim and asking what legal remedies existed for a property owner in their situation. She sealed all 4 envelopes, handed them to Denny for the morning stage. Denny took them without comment. He'd stopped questioning her at around day 10, which in its own way was a kind of victory. She went back inside, poured herself a cup of coffee that had gone cold and drank it anyway, and sat back down at the ledger. 37 days. She had worked with less time and fewer resources before. She had managed her father's failing farm with less information and more uncertainty and had kept it alive 2 years longer than anyone thought possible. She had crossed half a country with 43 cents and 1 dress and found her way to a place worth fighting for. She was not going to let November 30th arrive without having moved every piece on this board that she could reach. Outside, Preston was at the fence line with Walt and Hector, examining what Thomas had left behind, taking photographs with the deliberate care of men who now understood that every piece of evidence mattered. She watched them through the window for a moment. 3 men and 40 acres and 12 years of history, all of it hanging on the next 5 weeks. She turned back to the ledger. There was work to do. Doc Halverson's office was on the north end of Cutters Creek's Main Street, sandwiched between a dry goods store and a building that couldn't decide if it wanted to be a barber shop or a lawyer's office, and had compromised by being neither particularly well. The sign above the door said, Halverson, physician and notary, which in a town this size meant he was also, unofficially, the person you went to when you needed to think something through with someone who wasn't going to repeat it at the saloon. He was 67 years old, short, with white hair that went in its own direction, and spectacles he was always losing and finding in unexpected places. He had the particular manner of a man who had heard too many terrible things over too many years to be shocked by any individual terrible thing, which made him very easy to talk to. Magnolia had come alone. She'd thought about bringing Preston and decided against it. Preston's relationship with Halverson was neighborly but not close, the kind of acquaintance built on practical interactions over time, not on any particular trust. She needed the doctor to engage with the problem on its merits, not on his feelings about the Blackwood family history, and she'd found that sometimes you got a cleaner conversation by coming at it fresh, as yourself, without the weight of someone else's story preceding you. She told him everything. Not all at once. She laid it out methodically. The claim and the deadline and the legal challenge and the livestock and Thomas and the possible Phoenix connection, watching his face as she went to see what landed and what he was already tracking. He was a good listener in the way that doctors sometimes were, the kind who didn't interrupt but whose expressions told you when something mattered. When she finished, he took off his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back. "You know what you're describing," he said. "I know what I'm describing," she said. "If Bates has a contact in the Phoenix Land Office, that's not just a civil matter. That's corruption in a federal process." "I know that too." Halverson tapped his fingers on the desk. "The man I dealt with in Phoenix, during my own land business, was a senior clerk named Edmund Ferris. He's been there a long time, knows everyone. I found him honest, which is not something I say easily about men in that position. He paused. He would not be the corrupt one, but he might know who is. Can you write to him? I can do better than write, Halverson said. I'm going to Phoenix in 2 weeks to see my sister. I can speak to Ferris directly. Magnolia felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like a gear-finding purchase. That would be, yes, that would help significantly. I'm not doing this for nothing, Halverson said, and held up a hand before she could respond. Not money. I want to know the truth about the Blackwood fire. I've suspected for 7 years that the official verdict on that fire was wrong. If there's a chance this unravels enough to show it, I want to know. She looked at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment. James Blackwood was my friend, he said. Not a close friend, but a real one. The kind you don't make many of at my age. He died believing that Bates would eventually take that land no matter what he did. I'd like it if that turned out to not be true. She nodded. Then we're working toward the same thing. The meeting with Halverson happened on October 25th. On October 27th, the response came back from the Tucson Sheriff's Office. Not a letter, but a deputy named Sheriff's Investigator Cole Briggs, who arrived on the afternoon stage and came directly to Broken Spur as if he'd known exactly where to go, which suggested he'd gotten more information somewhere along the way than just her letter. Briggs was 40-something, lean, with the kind of eyes that had been trained to notice things other eyes moved past. He sat at the kitchen table with Magnolia and Preston and Walt and listened without speaking for almost an hour as they laid out what they had. The fence posts, the cattle count, the documentation of Thomas's false reference, the ledger entries for the quarterly payments, the timeline of Bates's legal maneuvers, the inspection statement. When they finished, he looked at his notes, flipped back through them, looked up. Thomas, he said. The hand. You have a physical description? Preston gave it. Briggs wrote it down. The name Thomas appear anywhere in connection with Bates's operation? We don't know enough about Bates's operation to say, Magnolia said. Briggs nodded. I might. He closed his notebook. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Blackwood. There have been complaints about Harlan Bates before, not about this specific situation, about land practices generally, the kind of complaints that are hard to act on because they're either civil in nature or they lack documentation. He looked at the table, at the papers spread across it. What you have here is more than any of those complainants had. You have physical evidence, a documented pattern, a timeline, and a witness, Walt Greer here, who can speak to the before and after on this ranch. Is it enough? Preston asked. Briggs was quiet for a moment. It's enough to investigate formally, he said. It's not yet enough to prosecute. The gap between those two things depends on what else we find. Thomas, Magnolia said. Finding Thomas would help considerably, Briggs agreed. A man who participated directly in livestock removal and had his identity concealed by a false reference is a man who has a lot of incentive to tell us who gave him his instructions if he's approached the right way. What do you need from us? Preston asked. Keep documenting, Briggs said. Everything, every incident, every date, every amount. If Bates does anything else before this resolves, another legal maneuver, any interference with the property, anything at all, write it down with dates and witnesses. He paused. And don't let on that I've been here, not in town, not to anyone. If Bates has been watching this ranch's movements, the last thing we need is him knowing the sheriff's office is involved. He left before supper. The afternoon stage back the same way he'd come, unremarkable. Walt watched the stage go from the porch. You trust him? He asked Magnolia. I trust that his interest and our interests line up, she said. For now, that's enough. The following week was a specific kind of difficult that didn't announce itself loudly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no lawyers appearing with briefcases, no fires in the night. Just the daily grind of keeping the ranch functioning while every other part of her mind was working on the problem, all the time, including the hours when she was supposed to be sleeping. She'd started waking at 4, lying in the dark, running through timelines and calculations until the ranch sound started up and gave her something to anchor to. She'd always been a problem solver to the point where the problems followed her into sleep, but this was different in degree. This had a deadline. November 30th was not moving, Preston noticed. He didn't say anything directly, that wasn't his way. but he started leaving coffee ready earlier in the morning, which was his way. He also started coming to the back room in the evenings, not specifically to discuss the ranch, but just to be present, sitting across the table with his own work or reading, the fire going, the quiet between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. She noticed that too. She noticed it and recognized it for what it was, and filed it in the growing collection of things she wasn't ready to examine. On the 1st of November, a letter arrived from the Phoenix Land Office. It was not the approval she'd been hoping for. It was an acknowledgement of Bates's legal challenge and a notification that the review of the Blackwood homestead claim had been formally paused pending resolution of the challenge. The letter was signed by a deputy administrator whose name she didn't recognize. She read it twice, set it down on the table. Preston read it, said nothing for a long moment. 29 days, he said. November 30th. 29 days, she agreed. She picked up her pen. I'm going to write to the senior administrator directly, she said. Not the deputy. The senior administrator can override a procedural pause if there's sufficient cause. The question is whether we can demonstrate sufficient cause. What constitutes sufficient cause? Evidence that the challenge was filed in bad faith as part of a pattern of interference with the claim, she said, which is exactly what we have if we frame it correctly. She wrote the letter that afternoon. 3 drafts. The final version was 3 pages, precise and documented, citing the livestock removal, the false fence posts, the concealed identity of Thomas, the quarterly payments to a fictitious land office contact, and the specific timeline demonstrating that Bates's legal challenge had been filed within days of receiving, from what appeared to be an inside source, information about the favorable inspection report. She was careful about what she claimed and what she suggested. She didn't allege corruption in the land office directly. She laid out the facts in the order that made the implication unavoidable without her having to make it. She sealed the letter, handed it to Preston. He read it. He read the whole thing, carefully, without interrupting. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet. My father tried for 4 years to make someone in Phoenix understand what Bates was doing, he said. He wrote letters. He got acknowledgement letters back. He paused. I don't want to hope too hard on this. Don't hope, she said. Just send it. He sent it. November 2nd brought something unexpected. Harlan Bates came to Broken Spur himself. He came in the early afternoon, alone, which was unusual enough to be alarming. Bates operated through intermediaries, lawyers, hired hands, strategic third parties. A man who came alone to someone's property was either very confident or making a particular kind of point. Walt saw him coming up the road and came to find Magnolia first, which told her something about how the internal order of the ranch had shifted over the past 6 weeks. He's got 1 rider with him, Walt said, stopped at the gate. She went to get Preston. They came out to the porch together, which she'd decided was important. Not behind the door, not sent separately, together and in plain view, the way people stand when they've decided they're not afraid of you. Bates looked the same as he had outside the general store. Big, deliberate, the money worn into the way he occupied space. The rider who'd come with him stayed back near the gate, which was itself a performance. I don't need backup to talk to you. Blackwood, he said. Then, Mrs. Blackwood. Neither of them responded to their names. They waited. Bates came up to the foot of the porch steps, but didn't come up them, which kept everyone at the same level. She noticed that. He was being careful about the physical dynamics of this conversation. I wanted to come personally, he said, because I think there's been enough going through lawyers and paperwork, and I'd like to have a plain conversation. All right, Preston said. I'm prepared to make you an offer, Bates said. A real one, not what I offered before. Enough money for you to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere that isn't contested, somewhere you don't have to fight for every acre. He looked at Magnolia briefly. For both of you. The silence held for a moment. You sent a man to steal my cattle, Preston said, and you want me to take money from you. Bates's expression didn't shift. He'd expected this. I don't know what you're referring to. Sure you don't. Preston. Bates's voice changed slightly. Not softer, but more direct. The way a man sounds when he set the performance aside briefly and is saying something he actually means. You are not going to win this. The legal process takes time that you don't have. The deadline passes, the claim resets, and I have the competing claim that's been active for 3 years. You can fight me through courts for another decade after that, but you won't have the land while you're doing it, and you won't have the money to sustain a decade of legal fights." He paused. "Take the offer. Take your wife and build something somewhere it isn't already being contested." Preston said nothing. Magnolia had been listening to every word. She'd been watching Bates's face, his hands, the way he was holding himself. There was something in the offer, not generosity. Bates didn't have that in him, but something real. He wanted this resolved. He was tired of the length of it. The legal challenge, the inspection complication, the letter to Phoenix. Something had shifted in his calculation, and he wanted to close the book on this before something else developed. He was worried about something. She didn't know what yet, but the offer itself told her they were closer to something than she'd realized. "No," Preston said. Bates looked at him. "No," Preston said again. "The land was my father's. It's mine. You don't get to buy it from me and call it an offer." Bates's expression settled into something that was harder and flatter than the genial presentation he'd worn coming up the road. "All right," he said, "I gave you the chance." He turned and walked back toward his rider. Magnolia said without raising her voice, "Mr. Bates." He stopped, turned. "The man you sent to work here," she said. "Thomas. We know the reference was false. We know how the fence posts were rigged. We have the cattle count from before and after." She paused. "I thought you should know what we have before this goes further." Bates looked at her. Something moved in his eyes. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of a man recalculating. "You're a long way from Ohio," he said. "I am," she agreed, "and I'm staying." He rode away. Preston was quiet for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded. Then, "He's going to move faster now." "Yes," she said, "which means we don't have the 26 days I thought we had." She was right. 3 days later, on the 5th of November, they found the first fire. Not the cabin, not yet. It was a section of the western fence line, 2 wooden posts burned at their bases, the wire sagging but intact. It could have been an accident. The dry November air, a careless campfire from someone passing through. It was not an accident. Preston and Walt were out at first light examining it when Magnolia came down to the barn for her morning check, and Denny met her at the door with an expression that told her before he said a word. She walked out to the fence line in the cold morning air and stood beside Preston and looked at the burned posts. "This is a message," she said. "I know. He's telling us what's coming if we don't take the offer." "I know that too." Preston crouched down, looked at the base of the burned post. "Done at night. No tracks worth following. Ground's too dry." He stood up. "He burned my father's cabin the same way. Middle of the night. No tracks." She looked at the damaged fence, looked at the line of it running away toward the north pasture, the whole boundary of what was being fought over. "Preston," she said carefully, "the cabin on the north pasture, the one you've been building to replace your father's original. Where is it in the construction?" He looked at her. "Shells up," he said. "Roof's on, not finished inside." "But it exists," she said. "It's a structure. It's the residential structure for the homestead claim." He understood where she was going. "If he burns that cabin, it doesn't automatically void the claim," she said quickly. "Not if the destruction is criminal and documented, but it complicates things. It gives his lawyers something to work with, another delay to manufacture, and it takes away the physical proof of occupancy that the land agent saw." "He knows that," Preston said. "He knew it 7 years ago too," she said. They stood there in the cold with the burned fence between them and the implications of it. "We can't watch the cabin every night," Preston said. "We don't have enough people." "Briggs," she said. "I need to contact Briggs today." She sent the wire that morning. Briggs's response came back by afternoon. He was coming. 2 days. He was bringing 2 deputies. 2 days felt like a long time. She spent them on the porch in the evenings, watching the darkness in the direction of the north pasture, which was not rational and was not going to stop anything, but was what she found herself doing. Preston found her there the second night, past 10, the cold significant enough that her breath was visible in the lamplight. He came out with a blanket and put it around her shoulders without saying anything. She pulled it tighter. "I keep thinking about your father," she said, waking up to the smell of smoke. Preston sat down in the other chair. So do I. He did everything right, she said. The filing, the occupancy, the claim process. He did it all correctly. Yes. And it almost didn't matter. Almost, Preston said. He looked out at the dark. It mattered enough that the land is still in dispute rather than just gone. It mattered enough that I could refile. It mattered enough that when you showed up with a letter about the right amendment to the 1862 Act, there was still something to defend. He paused. Almost isn't all the way. She thought about that. About how much work lived in the space between almost and all the way. He would have liked you, Preston said. This was the first time he'd said anything like this. The personal kind of thing, unprompted, the kind that cost something. She didn't respond immediately. She let it sit between them the way you let something settle before you try to move it. Tell me something about him, she said. Not about the fire or the claim. Just something about who he was. Preston was quiet for a moment. The blanket was warm and the night was cold and the lamp made a small circle of light that ended at the porch steps. He whistled when he worked, Preston said. Didn't know he was doing it. Same 3 tunes, rotating. I still catch myself listening for it sometimes when I'm out in the pasture. He paused. He was terrible at cards. We'd play on winter evenings, and he'd lose every hand and accuse me of cheating until I'd prove I wasn't, and then he'd say the cards were defective. A short sound that was almost a laugh. He believed in this land, not just as property. He talked about it like it was alive, like it was a thing that could be failed or honored. Magnolia thought about her own father, about his ledger books with the careful handwriting, about the farm in Ohio that had tried so hard and finally couldn't, about the chair by the window. My father believed in people that way, she said. Even ones who were going to disappoint him. He'd loan money to men he knew were bad risks because he said you didn't find out what someone was made of without giving them a chance to show you. She paused. He was usually wrong, but sometimes he wasn't. Preston looked at her. Is that where you got it? Got what? The thing where you extend something to people before they've earned it, he said. You did it with Denny. You did it with me. She thought about that. Probably, she said. Though I'd say in both cases there was evidence that made it more than blind faith. What evidence for me? She was quiet for a moment. The way you asked, she said. When you made the offer. You told me what you needed. You said I had no obligation. You gave me a way out. She pulled the blanket closer. Men who intend to use people don't generally provide exits. He was quiet. You could have pressured me, she said. I had 43 cents and nowhere to go. You had all the leverage. You didn't use it. Something shifted in his face. I thought about it, he said. The pressure. For about 10 seconds, when I could see you were about to walk out. I know, she said. He looked at her. How? Because you're not a man who does things easily, she said. You think them through first, and that takes a visible amount of effort. I saw the effort. He held her gaze for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Then he looked back out at the dark. Briggs gets here day after tomorrow, he said. Yes. And then? And then we set it up, she said. We make it look like the cabin is unguarded. We put Briggs and his deputies in position. She'd been working through the mechanics of it for 2 days. Bates won't come himself. He hasn't done that since the first fire, if he was even there for that. He'll send men. And if we catch the men, we have Bates. That's a significant if, Preston said. I know. If his men are smart, they'll do it in a way that's deniable. Same as Thomas. Maybe, she said, but Thomas had time to be careful. This is faster, which means more risk of a mistake. Bates is reacting now, not planning. Reacting people make different kinds of errors. Preston absorbed this. He had the look he got when he was running through something and finding it sound but not comfortable. You're asking us to use the cabin as bait. I'm asking us to be there when they come, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet. A long quiet. The working kind. All right, he said. When Briggs gets here, we plan it together. She nodded. Around them, the night was still, and the north pasture was dark, and the unfinished cabin sat out there in the cold with its new roof and its incomplete walls, neither fully built nor fully gone, much like everything else they were fighting for. Briggs arrived on the afternoon of November 7th with 2 deputies, both of whom looked competent and asked the right questions. They walked the property with Preston and Walt, examined the burned fence posts, looked at the repaired section where Thomas had set the false posts, took statements from Denny and Hector about what they'd observed in the weeks before Thomas disappeared. That evening, around the kitchen table, they planned it out. The cabin would appear unwatched. The ranch hands would visibly go about their evening routine, lights in the bunkhouse, nothing unusual. Briggs and his deputies would take positions before dark, inside the cabin, which was large enough to conceal 3 men if they were still, and in the brush along the western edge of the pasture. Magnolia and Preston would stay in the main house. "You're not going to the pasture," Briggs said to Preston. This was not a request. Preston's jaw worked. "It's my land." "Which is exactly why you can't be the one to engage his men if they come," Briggs said. "Anything that happens out there needs to be clean. Sheriff's office, legal authority, witnessed arrest. You go out there and it becomes a confrontation between landowners, and his lawyers will eat us alive." Preston stared at the table, said nothing. Magnolia put her hand on his forearm, not a gesture he'd been expecting. She could tell by the slight stiffness that came and went immediately. "He's right," she said quietly. Preston looked at her hand, looked at her. "I know he's right," he said. "That doesn't make it easier." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They settled on a 3-night window. The first night came and went with nothing. Cold, long, unremarkable. The deputies rotated in and out of the cabin in shifts, which meant there was always someone awake. The second night also passed without event, and Magnolia woke the next morning with the particular discouraged feeling of someone who has braced for something that hasn't come. On the third night, November 10th, at 2:17 in the morning, she was awakened by the sound of horses. She was at the window before she was fully awake, looking out toward the north pasture. The darkness was near complete. The moon was down and the stars gave just enough light to make shadows. She couldn't see the cabin from the main house. She couldn't see the pasture properly. She could see the shapes of 3 horses moving along the fence line toward the western corner. 3 men. Unhurried. The way men move when they don't expect to be observed. She crossed to Preston's door without thinking and knocked twice, sharp. He was already up. She could hear him moving. He came to the door dressed and alert, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. 3 riders, she said, western fence line, moving toward the cabin. He moved past her to the window. Outside, the shapes had stopped moving. There was a moment of stillness that lasted long enough to make her think she'd miscounted, or that they'd noticed something, or that the whole plan had gone sideways before it started. Then she saw the light. Small, at first. The particular orange of something catching, not a lamp, not a campfire, something that spreads. It moved along the base of the cabin's outer wall with a speed that was deliberate. Preston made a sound that she had no word for. Low. Like something knocked loose from somewhere deep. "Briggs is in there," she said, mostly to herself. "They're in position." For 10 seconds, nothing happened except the fire growing, then shouting. Not panicked, directed. The kind of shouting that is law enforcement, identifications, and commands. Then more shouting, different voices, then horses moving fast and someone coming off a horse, and the specific sounds of men who are not in agreement about what happens next. A gunshot, just one. Preston's hand found her arm in the dark. They stood at the window and watched and waited, which was the hardest thing Magnolia Winters had done in a life that had included a fair number of hard things. The fire at the cabin base was spreading, and then it wasn't, and she realized someone had gotten to it fast with something, water or dirt. The spread had been contained before it reached the wall proper. 15 minutes passed in geological time. Then a lamp came on near the cabin. Briggs's lamp, the signal they'd agreed on. The one that meant clear, come out. Preston was already moving toward the door. She followed. They came out into the cold November night and walked fast through the darkness toward the pasture. The stars were extraordinary overhead, indifferent the way stars always were, and the grass was stiff with cold, and the whole property smelled like the brief fire, acrid and fading. Briggs was standing outside the damaged cabin wall with a lamp in one hand and a look on his face that was tired and satisfied in equal measure. His 2 deputies were mounted, and between them on foot were 2 men with their hands bound. 2 men, not 3. "Third one rode before we could reach him," Briggs said before Preston could ask. "We have descriptions. We have the horses they came on, registered to a Bates property holding east of here. We have these 2, who were carrying flammable material consistent with deliberate arson. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "And we have this," he said. "Found on the one on the left. Written instructions. The cabin address, the timing, what to do if they encountered anyone." He paused. "The handwriting on the instructions. We'll need it verified, but I've got a sample from a public document Bates signed last year." Magnolia looked at the two men. One was young, barely older than Denny. One was older, with the specific look of a man who has made a series of poor decisions over a long period of time and has run out of road. She looked at the written instructions in Briggs's hand. "Is it enough?" she asked. Briggs folded the paper carefully, put it back inside his coat. "For arrest," he said. "And with what these two tell us to reduce their own charges? Yes. I think we're looking at enough." Preston stood beside Magnolia, looking at the two men and the damaged cabin wall and the dying smell of the fire that had almost been something much worse. His face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. Walt appeared from somewhere, as Walt always seemed to, and stood at Preston's other side. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Preston put his hand over Magnolia's, the one that had found his arm in the dark upstairs, and he held it there. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not even particularly surprising, given the 6 weeks of small movements that had been leading toward it. It was just two people standing in a cold field in the middle of the night with something that had been threatening to break them finally, possibly, showing the first sign of breaking a different way. She let him hold her hand. The lamp threw its small circle of light. The deputies had their men. The cabin stood with its scorched base and its intact walls and its new roof still solid against the November sky. Briggs was already talking about the ride to town, the documentation process, the wire to Phoenix. He was talking about Bates and timing and what came next. Magnolia heard all of it, but for just that moment, standing in the cold with Preston's hand over hers and the longest 6 weeks of her life behind her and something she couldn't name yet ahead, she let herself be exactly where she was. Just there. Just that. It was enough to stand on. Harlan Bates was arrested on the morning of November 12th, 2 days after his men were caught at the cabin. Briggs did it himself. He rode to the Bates property with both deputies and a warrant signed by a territorial judge in Tucson, who had, it turned out, been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The arrest was quiet, which surprised people who'd expected drama. Bates came out of his house, looked at the warrant, looked at Briggs, and said nothing. He got on the horse they brought for him and rode with them to town without resistance, which was the behavior of a man who had already calculated his options and found them limited, not the behavior of a man who was surprised. Magnolia heard about it from Walt, who'd ridden into Cutter's Creek that morning for supplies and come back with the news tucked alongside the flour and the lamp oil like it was just another item on the list. He told her in the kitchen, setting down the supply bags one by one, and she stood very still while he talked and then sat down at the table when he finished. Preston came in from the yard 10 minutes later, and she could tell from his face that he'd already heard from someone else. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything immediately because there wasn't a clean thing to say. This wasn't a moment that felt like victory. It felt more like the morning after a long storm. The damage was still visible, the ground was still wet, and you were standing in it trying to figure out what was left and what wasn't. "He didn't fight it," Preston said finally. "No," she said. "Because he knows it's not just the arson," he said. He'd worked through the same logic she had. If it were just the arson, he'd have fought it. He went quietly because he knows what else is coming. She nodded. The two men Briggs had arrested at the cabin had spent 48 hours in a cell doing the arithmetic on their own situations and had arrived at the obvious conclusion. One of them, the older one, the one with the long history of poor decisions, had started talking by the end of the first day. Not everything, but enough. Enough to name Thomas, whose full name turned out to be Thomas Edel, and enough to describe the arrangement by which Edel had been placed at Broken Spur, specifically to gather information and manipulate the cattle count, and enough to describe the man who had given those instructions. It wasn't Bates directly. It was never Bates directly. That was how he'd operated for 14 years, keeping enough distance between himself and the specific actions that nothing could be cleanly attributed. But the instructions had come from a man named Gareth Coles, who was Bates's ranch manager and had been for 8 years. and Gareth Coles's handwriting matched the written instructions found in the arrested man's coat, and Gareth Coles, when approached by Briggs on the evening of November 11th, had taken approximately 20 minutes to decide that his loyalty to Harlan Bates had a specific financial ceiling, and that ceiling had been reached. Coles told Briggs about the fire. Not this fire. The first one. 1878. The cabin that had burned while James Blackwood went out a window with 2 broken ribs. Coles hadn't been there himself. He'd been working for Bates only 4 years, he was careful to point out, as if tenure were a moral category. But he knew who had been there because the man who'd done it, the one who'd disappeared from the territory and whom Preston had spent 3 years trying to locate, was not as disappeared as everyone had assumed. His name was Amos Cutter, and he'd been living under a different name in New Mexico, working a small operation, and Coles knew this because Bates had been sending him money quarterly to stay gone and stay quiet, and the arrangement had been routed through Coles's own accounts. The quarterly payments, not the ones to the fictional Beaumont at the land office. Different ones, parallel ones, the same pattern repeated in 2 directions simultaneously. Bates paid people to act, and paid people to stay silent, and he'd been doing it so long and so systematically that it had become the architecture of his whole operation. When Magnolia heard this from Briggs, who came to the ranch on the afternoon of the 12th to update them personally, she thought about her father, about the way he'd say that dishonest men always built complicated structures, because the complication itself became a kind of camouflage. Simple things were transparent. Only complicated things could hide what was actually inside them. Her father had been right about a lot of things. He'd just run out of time to see most of them through. The legal process that followed was neither swift nor simple, because legal processes never were, and anyone who expected otherwise had not spent much time watching them operate. Bates was charged with conspiracy to commit arson, with criminal interference in a federal land claim process, and with a collection of related charges that the territorial prosecutor assembled with the focused energy of a man who had been handed something significant and knew it. Gareth Coles was charged separately and cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges, which was a transaction that offended Preston on a personal level and which Magnolia acknowledged was nevertheless necessary. The 2 men from this cabin were charged with arson and related offenses. Thomas Adele was located in late November in a small town outside of Albuquerque, arrested by a deputy who'd been given his description, and brought back to the territory to face charges of livestock theft and trespass. The man who'd presented himself as Beaumont, the fictional land office contact who'd taken Preston's quarterly payments for 8 months, turned out, through Halverson's contact in Phoenix, to be a low-level clerk at the district land office named Bernard Allweather, who had indeed been passing information about the Blackwood claim to Bates's people for 3 years. Not for large amounts of money, for modest, regular amounts that had seemed safe and unremarkable, but was quietly removed from his position and faced a separate federal inquiry, which moved at a pace that made the territorial court look impulsive by comparison. Through all of this, Magnolia kept the accounts. She documented everything, every date, every charge, every development, in the same ledgers she'd reorganized in her first week at Broken Spur, with the same methodical attention she'd given to supply costs and payroll gaps. She did it because it needed doing, and because she was the one who knew how to do it, and because keeping the record of things was, she'd come to believe, one of the most important acts available to ordinary people in the face of people who operated by obscuring records. She also, in those weeks, finished the supply chain restructuring she'd started in October, negotiated a new arrangement with a livestock buyer in Tucson that improved their per-head return by 14%, and identified a fencing contractor who could repair the western line for 40% less than the quote they'd been given the previous year by the man who turned out to have been mildly connected to the Bates network in a way that was too diffuse to be criminal but was very clear in retrospect. Walt noticed all of this. He didn't say anything about it for a long time, and then one evening, when she was working late in the back room, he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and set one down beside her ledger and said, "You know, James Blackwood kept these same books." She looked up. "Not as neat," he said, "and he couldn't add a column of figures twice and get the same answer. But he kept them because he believed the numbers told you the truth about a place, whether it was healthy or not." He sat down in the chair across from her. "These books look healthier than they have in 4 years." She looked at the ledgers, at the careful columns, the cleared accounts, the new supplier arrangements. The bones were good, she said. It just needed someone to pay attention to it consistently. Walt drank his coffee. Preston pays attention, he said. To the land, to the cattle, to the people who work here. He's good at that. He paused. He's not good at the numbers or the negotiations. He knows it and it costs him. His father was the same way. Another pause, the deliberate kind. You fill a gap that's been here a long time, is what I'm saying. She was quiet for a moment. Walt, she said, are you trying to have a personal conversation with me? He looked mildly affronted. I'm making an observation. About whether I intend to stay. He said nothing, which was his version of yes. She looked at the ledger, at the numbers that told the truth about a place. I'm staying, she said, if that's what you're asking. He nodded once, stood up, took his coffee cup and left. She heard him say something to Preston in the hallway. She couldn't make out the words. And then the front door, and then quiet. Preston appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. What did he say to you? She asked. He said to stop letting you work this late because you'd burn out and he'd spent too much time training you to replace you. He leaned against the doorframe. That's not what he actually said, but it's what he meant. She almost smiled. What did he actually say? Preston was quiet for a moment. He said I was going to regret it if I didn't say something before the year was out. He said it to the floor, which was as close as Preston Blackwood got to sheepish. He's been saying some version of that for 3 weeks. She set her pen down. The fire was going. Outside the window, November had finally settled into full cold, the kind that came off the desert floor and didn't lift until March. The ranch was quiet, in the way it got quiet after 8 in the evening, the hands in the bunkhouse, the animals settled. Preston, she said. He looked up. Come sit down, she said. He came and sat across from her in the chair Walt had just vacated, and looked at her across the table with all the careful attention he brought to things that mattered. I arrived here with 43 cents, she said. I want you to know that I know the difference between a decision made in desperation and a decision I would make again with a full range of options. She held his gaze. I would make this one again. He was very still. I'm not saying that to be kind, she said. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you've been wondering about it, and I'd rather you know. She paused. The arrangement we made that first day, I want it to be different, not because it's been wrong, because it's become something else, and I'd like us to be honest about what that is. Preston's hands were flat on the table. His face was doing the thing where several things happened behind it, and only one made it to the surface, and the one that made it through was something she had a name for now. Something she'd been watching develop over 11 weeks like a plant growing in unexpected soil. I'm not good at this, he said, saying things directly. You're better than you think, she said. Magnolia. He said her name the deliberate way he'd developed for it. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like less than it is. Try, she said. I'll tell you if it sounds like less. He looked at her. When you walked in here that first day and told me you wanted everything in writing and asked where the household accounts were kept, I thought, he stopped, tried again. I thought I'd made an arrangement that would solve a specific problem. That's all it was supposed to be. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I didn't know that I was also solving something I hadn't admitted was a problem. Something that had been empty for a long time, in the house and otherwise. She was quiet. She let him finish. I don't want the arrangement, he said. I want you, the actual version, not the practical one. And I know that's a different kind of ask, and you're allowed to need time or to have a different answer, and He stopped. I'll manage, either way. She looked at him, at this man who had spent 12 years fighting alone for something worth fighting for, who had learned to keep everything inside because there'd been nobody to give it to, who made almost smiles and flat, careful statements, and put coffee out early in the morning and blankets on chairs, and whose hands went flat on the table when he was containing something he couldn't afford to let out. She thought about what it meant to choose someone, not to fall into someone through circumstance or desperation or proximity, but to look at them clearly, with all the information available, and decide that this was the person. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. I'm not going to need time, she said, and I'm not going to have a different answer. He looked at her hand on his, looked up at her. All right, he said. The same words he'd used that first day when she'd said she wanted everything in writing, but completely different in weight. All right, she agreed. Outside, the November cold kept doing what it was doing, and the ranch sat in the dark being what it was. And inside the back room with the fire going and the ledgers open and two people who had arrived at something real through an improbable route, nothing was smooth or perfect or without complication. But it was true, and true was better. What? November 30th arrived on a Tuesday. The claim approval came through on November 28th, 2 days before the deadline, which was either excellent timing or the land office working at exactly the pace it was always going to work at, without any of the urgency that had consumed the people waiting on it. Senior Administrator Evander Polk at the Phoenix Land Office had received Magnolia's 3-page letter, had cross-referenced it with Halverson's visit to Edmund Ferris, had apparently also received some communication from Briggs's office through official channels, and had made a determination that the legal challenge filed by Harlan Bates was without merit and had been filed in a manner consistent with bad faith interference in a federal process. The approval arrived by wire on November 28th at 4 in the afternoon. Preston was in the yard when Denny brought it out, and Magnolia was on the porch, and she watched him read it, and watched the particular way his face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it would have looked in a story designed for drama, but quietly, the way relief arrives in a person who has been holding tension so long they've forgotten what the absence of it feels like. He looked up from the wire, found her face across the yard. She nodded once. He put the wire in his shirt pocket and went back to what he'd been doing, which was repairing a section of gate hinge that had been bothering him for a week. She watched him work for a moment, the careful, focused way he did physical tasks, the same attention he gave to everything, and then went back inside to the ledgers. Walt, who'd been leaning against the barn wall watching the whole exchange, said to nobody in particular, "Well, there it is." Denny, beside him, said, "What happens now?" "Now we get back to work," Walt said, "same as always." Which was exactly what happened. The ranch didn't transform overnight. The problems didn't evaporate. The cattle that Thomas Edel had moved off the property were partially recovered through the legal process. 11 of the 18 head were located and returned. The remaining 7 were compensated through a judgment that took another 4 months to fully execute. The legal proceedings against Bates moved through the territorial court with the deliberate pace of institutional processes everywhere, and there were delays and continuances and procedural maneuvers from Bates's defense lawyers that cost time and nerves before the final resolution came through. Bates was convicted in the spring. Conspiracy, criminal interference in a federal land process, and a reduced set of charges related to the 1878 fire, not the arson itself, since the direct evidence was old and primarily testimonial, but criminal conspiracy in the concealment of evidence and the ongoing payments to Amos Cutter to maintain that concealment. The sentence was significant. He would not be managing land or anyone else's affairs from where he was going. The Bates holdings were tied up in legal proceedings for over a year after that, and the piece of it adjacent to the north pasture was eventually acquired through a court-ordered sale by a family from New Mexico who raised horses and had no interest in anyone else's boundary disputes, which was the cleanest possible outcome. Magnolia read about the conviction in a letter from Briggs, who'd become something between a professional contact and a genuine acquaintance over the months of the case. She read it at the kitchen table on a March morning with coffee and the spring accounts open beside her, and she folded the letter and put it aside and felt not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter than either, something closer to completion. She went outside and found Preston at the fence line. He'd been spending more time at the north pasture since November, not anxiously, but the way you spend time with something once you've stopped being afraid of losing it. She came up beside him and handed him the letter. He read it, folded it, handed it back. "Cutter," he said. "What happens to Cutter?" Amos Cutter had been extradited from New Mexico in January and was facing charges in the territory. His case was separate from Bates's and slower moving. "The letter doesn't say specifically," she said, "but Briggs told me last month that the evidence from Cole's and Cutter's own financial records was enough. He's not going anywhere." Preston looked out at the north pasture. The spring had come to it differently than she'd seen in fall and winter. The grass was coming in thick along the creek edge, and the wildflowers that the desert produced briefly and extravagantly in March were doing their annual performance along the fence line. It was genuinely beautiful. She'd stopped being surprised by the beauty of this land, but hadn't stopped noticing it. "My father would have," Preston started. Stopped. She waited. He would have had something to say about this that was better than anything I can think of, he said. He was good with words when it mattered. I got the stubbornness and not the words. You have the words, she said. You just take your time with them. He looked at her. The spring light was doing what spring light does in Arizona, which was render everything cleaner and more specific than it looked at other times of year. Thank you, he said, for all of it. From the first day. She thought about the first day. About the woman who'd walked up that road with her satchel and her stubbornness and 43 cents, who'd been offered an impossible choice and had made it with both eyes open. She thought about what she'd been looking for when she started moving west. Not this, specifically. She hadn't been able to picture this, but something like the feeling of it. The feeling of being somewhere that was worth the trouble of being there. You're welcome, she said, for all of it. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was still not entirely a natural gesture for him. She could feel the slight deliberateness of it, the conscious decision. And she leaned into it, which was her own conscious decision, and they stood at the fence line of the north pasture in the March light and looked at what they'd kept. The year that followed was not uncomplicated, because years never are. There was a drought in summer that came hard and early and took 2 months of pasture water and required every calculation Magnolia had developed over the past year to keep the ranch solvent while they worked around it. There was a dispute with the livestock buyer in Tucson that turned acrimonious before it resolved. There was a week in August when Hector Ramirez's youngest daughter was sick with a fever that scared everyone on the property, himself most of all. And the ranch ran short-handed for 10 days while Hector was with his family. And Magnolia and Denny and Walt covered what needed covering without anyone suggesting that Hector should be anywhere other than where he was. Denny had become, over the course of that year, something she hadn't initially expected, a genuine ally. The transformation had been gradual and had no dramatic turning point. He'd simply started, one day at a time, making the choice to see her clearly rather than through the filter of what he'd assumed she was when she arrived. She respected that. It was harder than it looked, revising a first impression, and he'd done it without being asked. Walt remained Walt, which was all anyone could ask of Walt and more than most people managed. She and Preston had 2 significant arguments in the first year. The first was about money, specifically about how much to invest in expanding the cattle operation versus maintaining cash reserves during the drought. She thought he was moving too fast. He thought she was being overcautious. They argued about it for 3 days with the specific intensity of people who both knew what they were talking about and disagreed on the conclusion, and on the 4th day they arrived at a compromise that was better than either of their original positions, which was, she thought, the only outcome that justified arguing about anything. The second argument was more personal and harder. It came in October, around the time of their 1-year mark, on a night when she was tired and he was withdrawn in the way he sometimes got. The old habit of keeping things interior, and she said something about it that was more pointed than she'd intended, and he said something back that closed off rather than opened, and they went to bed not speaking, which was the worst night she'd had at Broken Spur since the anxiety of November's countdown. She lay awake thinking about what her mother used to say about marriages. Her mother had not had the most straightforward opinions on the subject, but she'd said one thing that Magnolia had always remembered. You don't choose someone once. You choose them over and over, every time it would be easier not to. She got up at 4 in the morning and went downstairs and made coffee. Preston was already there. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. He pushed a cup toward her, which was what he did. I'm sorry, he said, about what I said. I'm sorry for how I said what I said, she said. What you said wasn't wrong, he said. The way I shut down, I know why you do it, she said. I'm not asking you to stop entirely. I'm just asking you to come back faster. He was quiet. I'm working on that, he said. I know you are, she said. They drank their coffee and the argument was not erased. Arguments don't erase. They become part of the history of a thing. But it was behind them, and they were both still there, and that was the point. In the spring of their 2nd year, Magnolia wrote a letter to Ohio. She'd been putting it off for a long time without fully acknowledging she was putting it off. Her father's old business partner, a man named Harwell, who'd been decent to her during the worst of the estate settlement, had written to her twice since she'd left, and she'd meant to answer and hadn't. Not because she didn't want to, but because answering meant drawing a line between who she'd been in Ohio and who she was here, And for a long time, she hadn't been ready to draw that line. Now she drew it. She told Harwell about the ranch, about the land claim, about what the last 2 years had been. She told him about Preston, plainly, the way you describe a person to someone who will never meet them but deserves an honest picture. She told him that she was well. Not fine. Well. There was a difference, and she'd spent enough time saying fine to have a good sense of what the other thing felt like. Harwell wrote back in June. He said he was glad. He said her father would have been glad. He said her father had always thought she would find her way to something worthy of her, and that he'd been right, and that this was one of the few instances in Harwell's experience where a man had been right about something important. She read that letter 3 times. She kept it in the satchel, alongside the photograph of her parents and the old ledger she'd carried west with no practical purpose. These were the things that told her where she'd come from. She needed them near for the same reason you need to know which direction is north. Not because you're always going that way, but because knowing it keeps everything else properly oriented. It was Walt who suggested the porch in the evenings had become a different kind of institution than it had been in the beginning. He said this in November. In the particular dry way he said things that were observational but carried something beneath the observation. He said it, and then he went back to whatever he'd been doing, which left Preston and Magnolia on the porch, with the statement between them. "He's not wrong," Preston said. She looked out at the property, at the fence lines and the barn and the yard and the distant line of the north pasture in the evening light. 2 years of seasons had changed how she read this landscape. She knew its sounds now, the specific way the wind moved through the pasture grass in different months, the way the animals behaved in the hours before rain, the particular silence that came before the desert cold settled in for the night. She knew this place, not just as a place she lived or a problem she'd helped solve, as a place that was hers in the way that comes only from having fought for something alongside it, from having been changed by it while helping it change. "Walt thinks we should expand the porch," Preston said. "Walt has opinions about a lot of things," she said. "He's usually right." "He's usually right," she agreed. Preston was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that had something behind it. The kind she'd learned in 2 years to recognize as the prelude to something he'd been turning over internally for a while. "I want to build a proper office," he said, "for the accounting work. Not the back room, well, a real room, with a bigger window." He paused. "And shelves, for the ledgers." She looked at him. "Walt says the back room has been too small for 2 years, he said. "Walt says a lot. He says it would help." Preston turned to look at her. "I was thinking, the room that's been empty on the east side, it gets the morning light." She thought about the morning light in that room. She'd looked in it twice and registered it each time. A good room, south-facing enough to stay warm even in winter, north-facing enough to catch the early sun. "That would work," she said. He nodded. Then he reached over and took her hand the same way he had that first night in the north pasture, with Briggs's lamp throwing its circle of light, except that it was completely natural now, the way things become natural when you've done them enough times and meant them each time. She thought about the woman who'd walked up this road 2 years ago, with a worn satchel and a failed family legacy and 43 cents and nowhere left to go. She thought about what that woman had wanted, which at the time was very specific and very small. A roof, a meal, a place to put her feet down that wasn't moving. She'd gotten those things. She'd also gotten things she hadn't known to want. Things she wouldn't have known to put on a list because she hadn't had the framework yet to understand they were missing. Partnership. Not the romantic idea of it, but the working reality. Someone who saw the same problem you did and brought different tools to it and was willing to argue about the approach and still be there in the morning. Trust. The kind that builds the way stone walls build, one piece at a time, tested by pressure, and stronger for it. A place that needed her and was better for her being there, and that she was better for being part of. None of it was perfect. The account still had difficult months. The cattle operation still faced drought and disease and market fluctuations that no amount of careful bookkeeping could fully insulate against. Preston still went interior sometimes in ways that required patience. She still woke at 4 in the morning running calculations. Walt's knees were getting worse and the day was coming, probably in the next 2 or 3 years, when the work would need restructuring to account for that, and she was already thinking about how. These were the real things, not the clean version, The clean version was for people who needed the story to be simpler than it was. The real version was two people on a porch in the evening dark, with the work of the day behind them and the work of the next day already forming, with a property that had been fought for and held and was now actively growing, with a history between them that included desperation and risk, and arguments and small kindnesses, and the specific intimacy of people who have been through something serious together and come out intact. The real version was enough, more than enough. The stars came up over Arizona the way they always did, indifferent and extraordinary. The same stars that had been overhead when she'd walked up this road with her worn-out boots and her one dress. The same stars that had been overhead on the night in the north pasture when they'd waited for Briggs's lamp signal. "Preston," she said. "Hmm?" "The east room," she said. "I want 2 windows, not 1, if we're doing it properly." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him almost smiling beside her. "2 windows," he said. "And proper shelves," she said. "Not the kind Walt builds. Actual built-in shelves. Walt is going to take that personally. Walt will survive," she said. He laughed. Not the almost version. An actual laugh, real and unguarded, the kind she'd been drawing out of him gradually for 2 years and still felt like something rare when it arrived. She held on to his hand. The night settled in around them, and the ranch sat in its quiet, and somewhere out past the barn, the north pasture ran its 40 acres down to the creek in the dark, patient and whole, and finally, definitively, theirs. Not because of luck, not because anything was handed to them or fell into place cleanly or worked out the way it was supposed to in a simpler kind of story, but because 2 people, both of them imperfect and both of them trying, had decided that the thing in front of them was worth fighting for, and had kept making that decision every day through all the days it was hard. That was all it ever was. That, it turned out, was everything.